had shocked him into remembering that promise. It had allowed his mortal conscience to take over again and defeat Kronos. His weak spot, his Achilles heel, had saved us all. Next to me, Annabeth's knees buckled. I caught her, but she cried out in pain, and I realized I'd grabbed her broken arm. Oh, God. Annabeth, I'm sorry. It's all right, she said as she passed out in my arms. She needs help, I yelled. I've got this. Apollo stepped forward. His fiery armor was so bright it was hard to look at, and his matching Ray-Bans and perfect smile made him look like a male model for battle gear. God of medicine at your service. He passed his hand over Annabeth's face and spoke an incantation. Immediately, the bruises faded. Her cuts and scars disappeared. Her arms straightened, and she sighed in her sleep. Apollo grinned. She'll be fine in a few minutes. Just enough time for me to compose a poem about our victory. Apollo and his friends save Olympus. Good, eh? Thanks, Apollo, I said. I'll, let you handle the poetry. The next few hours were a blur. I remembered my promise to my mother. Zeus didn't even blink an eye when I told him my strange request. He snapped his fingers and informed me that the top of the Empire State Building was now lit up blue. Most mortals would just have to wonder what it meant, but my mom would know. I had survived. Olympus was saved. The gods set about repairing the throne room, which went surprisingly fast with 12 super-powerful beings at work. Grover and I cared for the wounded, and once the Sky Bridge reformed, we greeted our friends who had survived. The Cyclopes had saved Thalia from the fallen statue. She was on crutches, but otherwise she was okay. Connor and Travis Stoll had made it through with only minor injuries. They promised me they hadn't even looted the city much. They told me my parents were fine, though they weren't allowed into Mount Olympus. Mrs. O'Leary had dug Chiron out of the rubble and rushed him off to camp. The Stolls looked kind of worried about the old centaur, but at least he was alive. Katie Gardner reported that she'd seen Rachel Elizabeth Dare run out of the Empire State Building at the end of the battle. Rachel had looked unharmed, but nobody knew where she'd gone, which also troubled me. Nico D'Angelo came into Olympus to a hero's welcome, his father right behind him, despite the fact that Hades was only supposed to visit Olympus on winter solstice. The god of the dead looked stunned when his relatives clapped him on the back. I doubt he'd ever gotten such an enthusiastic welcome before. Clarice marched in, still shivering from her time in the ice block, and Ares bellowed, "There's my girl!" The god of war ruffled her hair and pounded her on the back, calling her the best warrior he'd ever seen. "That Drakon slaying? That's what I'm talking about!" She looked pretty overwhelmed. All she could do was nod and blink like she was afraid he'd start hitting her. But eventually she began to smile. Hera and Hephaestus passed me. And while Hephaestus was a little grumpy about my jumping on his throne, he thought I'd done a pretty bang-up job, mostly. Hera sniffed in disdain. "I suppose I won't destroy you and that little girl now." "Annabeth saved Olympus," I told her. "She convinced Luke to stop Kronos." Hera whirled away in a huff, but I figured our lives would be safe, at least for a little while. Dionysus's head was still wrapped in a bandage. He looked me up and down and said, "Well, Percy Jackson, I see Pollux made it through, so I suppose you aren't completely inept. It's all thanks to my training, I suppose." Yes, sir," I said. Mr. D nodded. "As thanks for my bravery, Zeus has cut my probation at that miserable camp in half. I now have only 50 years left instead of 100. 50 years, huh? I tried to imagine putting up with Dionysus until I was an old man, assuming I lived that long. Don't get so excited, Jackson, he said, and I realized he was saying my name correctly. I still plan on making your life miserable. I couldn't help smiling. Naturally. Just so we understand each other. He turned and began repairing his grapevine throne, which had been singed by fire. Grover stayed at my side. From time to time, he would break down in tears. So many nature spirits dead, Percy. So many. I put my arm around his shoulders and gave him a rag to blow his nose. You did a great job, G-Man. We will come back from this. We'll plant new trees. We'll clean up the parks. Your friends will be reincarnated into a better world. He sniffled dejectedly. I suppose. But it was hard enough to rally them before. I'm still an outcast. I could barely get anyone to listen to me about Pan. Now, will they ever listen to me again? I led them into a slaughter. They will listen, I promised, because you care about them. You care about the wild more than anyone. He tried for a smile. Thanks, Percy. I hope you know I'm really proud to be your friend. I patted his arm. Luke was right about one thing, G-Man. You're the bravest satyr I ever met. He blushed, but before he could say anything, conch horns blew. The army of Poseidon marched into the throne room. Percy! Tyson yelled. He charged toward me with his arms open. Fortunately, he'd shrunk back to normal size, so his hug was like getting hit by a tractor, not the entire farm. You are not dead, he said. Yeah, I agreed. Amazing, huh? He clapped his hands and laughed happily. I am not dead either. Yay! We changed Tyson. It was fun. Behind him, 50 other armored Cyclopes laughed and nodded and gave each other high fives. Tyson led us, one rumbled. He is brave, the bravest of the Cyclopes, another bellowed. Tyson blushed. Was nothing. I saw you, I said. You were incredible. I thought poor Grover would pass out. He's deathly afraid of Cyclopes. But he steeled his nerves and said, Yes, 3 cheers for Tyson. Yar! The Cyclopes roared. Please don't eat me, Grover muttered, but I don't think anyone heard him. The conch horns blasted again. The Cyclopes parted, and my father strode into the throne room in his battle armor, his trident glowing in his hands. Tyson, he roared. Well done, my son. And Percy. His face turned stern. He wagged his finger at me, and for a second I was afraid he was going to zap me. I even forgive you for sitting on my throne. You have saved Olympus. He held out his arms and gave me a hug. I realized, a little embarrassed, that I'd never actually hugged my dad before. He was warm, like a regular human, and he smelled of a salty beach and fresh sea air. When he pulled away, he smiled kindly at me. I felt so good, I'll admit I teared up a little. I guess until that moment, I hadn't allowed myself to realize just how terrified I had been the last few days. Dad, shh, he said. No hero is above fear, Percy. And you have risen above every hero. Not even Hercules
Poseidon!
A voice roared. Zeus had taken his throne. He glared across the room at my dad, while all the other gods filed in and took their seats. Even Hades was present, sitting on a simple stone guest chair at the foot of the hearth. Nico sat cross-legged on the ground at his dad's feet.
Well, Poseidon,
Zeus grumped.
are you too proud to join us in council, my brother?
I thought Poseidon was going to get mad, but he just looked at me and winked.
I would be honored, Lord Zeus.
I guess miracles do happen. Poseidon strode over to his fishing seat, and the Olympian Council convened. While Zeus was talking, some long speech about the bravery of the gods, etc., Annabeth walked in and stood next to me. She looked good for someone who'd recently passed out. "Miss much?" she whispered. "Nobody's planning to kill us so far," I whispered back. "First time today." I cracked up, but Grover nudged me because Hera was giving us a dirty look.
As for my brothers,
Zeus said.
we are thankful.
He cleared his throat like the words were hard to get out.
Thankful for the aid of Hades.
The Lord of the Dead nodded. He had a smug look on his face, but I figure he'd earned the right. He patted his son Nico on the shoulders, and Nico looked happier than I'd ever seen him.
And of course,
Zeus continued, though he looked like his pants were smoldering,
we must, thank Poseidon. I'm sorry, brother,
Poseidon said.
What was that? We must thank Poseidon,
Zeus growled.
Without whom it would have been difficult.
Difficult? Poseidon asked innocently.
Impossible,
Zeus said.
Impossible to defeat Typhon.
The gods murmured agreement and pounded their weapons in approval.
Which leaves us,
Zeus said,
only the matter of thanking our young demigod heroes, who defended Olympus so well, even if there are a few dents in my throne. He called Thalia forward first, since she was his daughter, and promised her help in filling the hunters' ranks.
Hey Alexa, what time is it?
Artemis smiled.
The time is
You
6:35
have done
a.m.
well, my lieutenant. You have made me proud. And all those hunters who perished in my service will never be forgotten. They will achieve Elysium, I am sure. She glared pointedly at Hades. He shrugged.
Probably.
Artemis glared at him some more.
Okay.
Hades grumbled.
I'll streamline their application process.
Thalia beamed with pride. Thank you, my lady. She bowed to the gods, even Hades, and then limped.